Let's talk about radical expressions. A radical expression is an algebraic expression that involves roots, actually. It doesn't have to be a square root, but in our book we're only focusing on square roots. It could be a cube root, a fourth root, a fifth root, but our chapter here only deals with the square root. So it might look something like this. An example of radical expression could be 4 the square root of y. That's a radical expression. Or 5 plus the square root of x. These are called radical expressions. They have square roots in them. It's an algebraic expression, that's what these are, and they involve having square roots. So you heard me mention the word square root. So what is a square root? So a square root of a non-negative, maybe I'll put a hyphen here, I don't have to, a non-negative real number is non-negative real number. We'll call, for example, A is a number that when squared the result is A. So let's take an example, the square root of 16. 16 is a non-negative number. The square root, this little hook here, this one, it's called the radical sign. And the 16 here, that's called the radicand. So what is the square root of 16? Let's go back to the definition. The square root of a non-negative number. This is non-negative number. Non-negative means 0 or positive. Is a number that when squared is A. I should say a non-negative number actually is a non-negative number. Let me change it here. A is my eraser here. That's a better definition. It's a non-negative number that when squared the result is A. So let's look at the 16. Give me a non-negative number that when you square it the result is 16. And the only non-negative number that when I square it the result is 16 is plus 4. Can't be a negative. So if you take the 4, multiply it by itself, 4 times 4, that's a 16. What is the square root 25? Give me a number, a non-negative number, that when you multiply it by itself, the result is 25. The answer to that is 5. What is the square root of 9? Give me a non-negative number, that when you multiply it by itself, the result is 9. That's a 3. What is the square root of 0? 0 is a non-negative number, that when you multiply it by itself, the result is 0, and the only one I know is 0. Give me the square root of 4. Find a number. If you multiply it by itself, the result is 4. Can't be negative. That's a 2. What's the square root of 1? Give me a non-negative number that if you multiply it by itself, the result is 1. And that's the 1. Let's try a few more. Remember, the number under the square root can't be negative. So this is what we know so far. If I list, what do I know? The square root of 0 is 0. The square root of 1 is 1. I'm looking at the numbers right here on the bottom. The square root of 4 is 2. The square root of 9 is 3. The square root of 16 is 4. All these we did them. The square root of 25 is 5. Who has an answer of 6? What's 6 times 6? 36? Who has an answer of 7? What is 7 times 7? It's the square root of 49. 8 is actually a 64, 8 times 8. So the square root of 64 is 8. The 9 is 9 times 9, 81. The square root of 81 is 9. The 10, what's 10 times 10? That's 100. I'll do a few more. The square root of 11, 11 times 11, the answer is 11. 11 times 11 is the square root of 121. I'll do one more. The square root of 144, 12 times 12 is 144. That's a 12. So those are the common ones. Notice all these numbers are non-negative numbers. What happens if I come in and says, what is the square root of minus 4? The answer to that is no real solution. Down the road, as you take more math classes, we'll say there's an imaginary solution. But for now, there's no real solution. It can't be done. If I just have a basic calculator and I try that in, probably will give me an error. I thought I have a basic calculator, but I don't have one here. What is minus the square root of 9? Notice the minus is outside the square root. So the minus is in the front, and what is the square root of 9? What's the answer to this? The square root of 9 is what? 3, so the result of this question is negative 3. What is negative 3 the square root of 25? Well, that means negative 3 times the square root of 25. And what is the square root of 25? Isn't that a 5? You can see it right here. The square root of 25 is 5. What's negative 3 times 5? Negative 15. What is 5 times the square root of 49? That's 5 times the square root of 49. The square root of 49 is what? 7. 5 times 7, which is 35. Now what happens if somebody comes and says, what's the square root of 2? Now the 2 is not one of those numbers. In this case, you have to use a calculator that has a square root on it. Because there is no number that I know off the top of my head that if I multiply it by itself, the result is 2. But if you have a calculator and you plug it in, you will see something like this, 1.4142. And it keeps going, actually. It doesn't end there. There's more digits to it. But if you take that number and multiply it by itself, that will give you the 2. The same thing with the 3. The 3 is not one of those numbers. So I don't know of a number that if you multiply it by itself, the result is 3. But if I have my calculator with me, we'll say 1.4142 7, 3, 2, 0, and more digits to come. Square root of 7, again, 7 is not one of those numbers. We know a number times itself will give me a 7. It's not here. The calculator for that. 2.6457. So in some cases we do have to use calculators there. Looking for a calculator, I don't have one, so I'll use my iPhone. If you turn it sideways, it becomes a scientific calculator. Here we go. I gotta see which one's the square root. I can't really tell. So let's try the 2. There's the 2, and I had the square root of that. There we go. 1.414213. I don't know if you can see that. Clear it. Let's try another one. Take the 3, and I go the square root of that. That's the square root. Equals. I hit 2, I guess. Let's try the 3. Where's the 3? The 3. Take the square root of 3. Uh-oh, I gotta clear it. Where's the clear button here? Oh, clear. Here we go. Let's try the 3, or the square root of 3 equals. Oh, I gotta hit that first, then a square root, then equals. That's not a square. Oh, I'm sorry. That's not the square root. I need a bigger calculator, a real one. There's the square root key. I think is right here. I think that's a 2 there. So let's try that. 3, the square root of 3. Yep, 1.732. My eyes are nothing great there. Let's try the 2. The square root, I think there's a 2 on the top, of 2. 1.414. Let me try the 7. 7, the square root. 2.6457, and there's more. So you need a calculator to do these numbers. A lot of times when you're looking at the square root, I just noticed on our calculator, we write the square root like this. The square root means we have a number on the top here, that's really the number 2. So if you have one of those calculators that has numbers on it, that is what the square root. It says find the number. If you multiply it by itself 2 times, that tells you how many times. 2 times the result is, in this case, 1.414. So the square root of 25, that's the same as the square root of 25, and we put the 2 here. Find the number. If you multiply it by itself 2 times, the answer is 25. 5 times 5 is 25. And it made me think about, when I looked at this calculator here, it has the 2 on the top there. It has the 2, it has the 3, it has any value. I just couldn't see them. So how do we simplify radicals? How do we simplify them? If we are dealing let's assume we're dealing with non-negative numbers. So the topic here is simplifying radicals. Again, if A is a non-negative number, a non-negative number, then the square root of a squared, it's always going to equal to a. Why? Take the a, multiply it by itself. What's a times a? A squared. So that's the rule I'm going to be using. The square root of a squared is a. Sometimes actually we write the square on the outside of that. If we do the square root of a, the whole thing squared, that's the same as really as the one above it. That's also an a. So what is examples here? What is the square root of 25 squared? Using that rule here, the result should be 25. It should equal to 25. If you don't like doing them that way, let's look at it slowly. Let's find the value for what's under the square root. What is the square root of 25? Let me find my sheet of paper. The square root of 25, according to this sheet, is what? That's a 5. So if I replace the square root 25 with 5, what is 5 squared equal to? That is a 25. What is the square root of 4 squared? Now again, here's the outside brackets, the 2. What's the square root of 4? Look at that sheet here. The square root of 4 is what? 2. And what is 2 squared? What's 2 times 2? That's a 4. What is the square root of 4 squared? I can jump to this method and I go, oh, I know what the answer. The answer is 4. Using that rule right here. The square root of something squared, a number squared is just a number, as long as the number is not negative. If you don't like that, the way I did it using that method, the other option is to take the 4 and square it first. Here we go, let's redo it again. What is 4 squared? Well, I know 4 squared is 16. And if I bring my sheet back, what is the square root of 16? What number, non-negative number, if you multiply it by itself, the answer is 16. And the only one I can think of it is the 4. 4 times 4 is 16. So the answer to that is 4. So you can do it this way, or if you memorize that rule, just know the answer is going to be whatever that number is. What is the square root of 9 squared? I can use that rule. The answer is directly 9 in one step. So these really handy rules to make the problem a bit quicker. These two. What is the square root of 6 the whole thing squared? Again, that's this rule right here. The answer should be that number, which is in this case 6. What is the square root of 5 squared? The answer is 5. What is the square root of 7 squared? Using this one, the answer is 7. And what is the square root of t squared? Using this rule, that's a t. If you want to see the math behind it, why, if you really want to know why, we can give you the answer. The square root actually means the power of 1/2. So when you look at that problem, The square root of 6 means 6 to the 1/2. That's what the square root means, the power of 1/2. Raise the whole thing to the power of 2. And if you remember the rules for exponents, when you're multiplying power to power, you multiply the exponents. What is 1/2 times the 2? That's a 1. 6 to the 1 is 6. This one here, the square root of 5 means 5 to the 1/2, the whole thing squared. Again, power to power you multiply, 1/2 times 2, which is a 1, and that's a 5. This one, I have 7 squared and the square root of that. There's the 7 squared, the whole thing under the square root, that means the whole thing to the power of 1/2. It's backward. Same rule, power to power you multiply, 2 times a half, that's a 1, and that's the 7. This one, t squared, the whole thing to the power of 1/2. What's 2 times a 1/2? That's a 1, which is just t. Now this method might come in handy, because what about if I come in and I said to you, what is the square root of x to the 4th? If we apply these rules that you saw here, that means that's x to the 4th to the power of 1/2. And what is 4 times a half? That's 4 over 2, which is a 2. What is the square root of y to the 8th? This is y to the 8, the whole thing to the 1/2. Power to power you multiply. 8 times 1/2 is 8 over 2, which is what? Y to the 4th. So the easiest thing to do is, really, instead of going through all these steps, is take the power and divide it by 2. So what is the square root of c to the power 20? Divide the 20 by 2, which ends up being what? C to the 10. Because that's what that means. Multiplying by 1/2 is the same as dividing by 2. What is the square root of m to the power of 40? Divide the 40 by 2, that's m to the power of what? 20. Now, if the problem gets a little bit bigger, we need to figure a way to simplify it. Let's look at something called the product rule of radical. Product means multiplications. The product rule of radicals. And that rule says if you have a square root and under it a times b, you have an option. You can break it down to the square root of a times the square root of b, if that would make the problem easier. You can go from this to this, or you can go from this to this. You can go back and forth. And this really comes in handy as the problem gets bigger. Like what? Now I come into you and I said, can you tell me what is the square root of 16x to the 4th? You go, well, I know that's the square root of 16 times x to the 4th. Which means break it down to the square root of 16, using that rule here, times the square root of x to the 4th. We keep going to that one. Now I'll go to my list of square roots. What is the square root of 16? Square root of 16 is 4. And this one will be x, and you take the power and divide it by 2. What's 4 divided by 2? That's a 2. 4x squared. Let's try another example. What is the square root of 100 a to the 4th b squared? Again, that's really multiplication. We just don't put the multiplication. So if you want, you can put the multiplication symbol between them. So I should be able to break it down using this rule to the square root of 100 times the square root of a to the 4th times the square root of b squared. What is the square root of 100? That's a 10. What is the square root of a to the 4th? The variables, just divide the power by 2. 4 divided by 2 is 2. The variable, divide the power by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. So my answer is 10a squared b. We'll try another one. There's a minus the square root of 121 x to the 6 y to the 8th. Here's the minus in the front. That's a multiplication. I should be able to break it down. The square root of 121 times the square root of x to the 6 times the square root of y to the 8th. This is minus the square root of 121 from the chart. That's 11. When I say the chart, that's these numbers. The 121, the square root of that is 11. The square root of x to the 6, divide 6 by 2, that's x cubed. The square root of y to the 8th, divide the 8 by 2, that's a 4. So my answer is negative 11 x to the 3rd, y to the 4th. Let's look at another place where we can use this method. If I said to you simplify, the square root of 48. Now, I can't use a calculator. They don't want us to use a calculator for this. So I need to look at the 48. It says, is there a way I can write this 48 as some multiplication? Could it be 16 times 3? What's 16 times 3? Is that 48? And the reason I chose 16, because 16, I know the answer to it. I don't want to use 12 times 4, for example. Well, I could use 12 and 4, but keep working with it. But I don't want to pick numbers I don't know the answer to it. And I'll give you an example in a few minutes what I mean by that. 48 is actually 16 times 3. So I should be able to break that to the square root of 16 times the square root of 3. What is the square root of 16? That's 4. The square root of 3, I can't simplify it. And I'm going to leave it like that. 4 times the square root of 3. Another one. Now I know what you're thinking. You're going to 50 is 5 times 10, which is correct. So I should be able to break it down to the square root of 5 times the square root of 10. But here's the problem with that. None of these numbers are here. I don't know what the square root of 5 is. What number, if you multiply it by itself, the answer is 5? Your guess is as good as mine. What number, if you multiply it by itself, the answer is 10? Again, your guess is good as mine. So nothing wrong with this, but probably not a good choice. So let's think about the 50. Instead of 5 times 10, I can write the 50 as what? 25 times 2. So I should be able to break it down to the square root of 25 times the square root of 2. And 25 is actually a good number because what's the square root of 25? That's a 5. 5, the square root of 2. So you want to choose numbers, when you break it down, you want to choose numbers that you know the answer to. Simplify. Negative 4, the square root 27. Well, that's equal to negative 4 times the square root of 27. Now 27, let's think about that. Can we simplify the 27? I can think of 9 times 3. So I should be able to write that the square root of 9 times the square root of 3. 9 is actually a good number because what's the square root of 9? That's a 3. Square root of 9 is 3. So I'm going to take the square root of 9 now, take it out, and replace it with just 3, not the square root, just 3. What's negative 4 times 3? That's a negative 12, the square root of 3. Simplify. The square root of 24 divided by 6. Again, let's look at the 24. Can we break the 24 using any of these numbers? I know 8 times 3 is 24, but notice none of these numbers is 8 or 3. Not good. What else 24? Could it be 4 times 6? That's the square root of 4 times the square root of 6 over the 6. What is the square root of 4? The square root of 4 is actually 2. Now this is a fraction. You can divide the top and the bottom by the same number. If I divide this by 2, that's a 1. Divided by 2, that's a 3. So my answer is 1 times the square root of 6, which is the square root of 6 over the 3. Okay, let's continue with that. Let me give you a simpler one. What's the square root of y to the 10? We said take that 10 divided by 2. Dividing 10 by 2, that's y to the 5. Not a big deal. What is the square root of y to the 5th? Now we got a problem. Can you divide the 5 by 2? The answer is no. We can't. It's 2.5. We don't want to use decimal order fractions. I'm going to find the biggest number that's less than 5, and at the same time you can divide it by 2. And the only one I can think of is 4. 4 is less than 5, and you can divide it by 2. Why am I interested in that? Because now I can write the y to the 5th as y to the 4th times y. If you remember, when you multiply, you add your exponents. What is 4 plus 1? It makes it a 5. Why is this good? Because now I can break it down to the square root of y to the 4th times the square root of y. I know the answer to this one. This one here gives me y to the power of 2, because you got to divide the power by 2, times the square root of y. Let's try this one. Negative the square root of 20 a to the 6. Here's the minus sitting in the front. I can say the square root of 20, the square root of a to the 6. 20 is not a good number. I can break the 20 down to what? 4 times 5. And what's the answer to this? That's a 2, and there's the minus sign in the front. The square root of 5 still there. What is the answer to this? Take the 6 and divide it by 2, that's a to the 3rd. And we always like to put the ones without the square root together. So let me take the negative 2 times the a to the 3rd. That will make it negative 2a to the 3rd. And now you still have the square root of 5. So I took these two, multiplied them together, and put them in the front. The square root of 60 x to the 5th times y I can break this one down, the square root of 60 times the square root of x to the 5th times the square root of y. $60, I don't know the answer to it, but I can break it down to 4 times 15. X to the 5th, can you divide the 5 by 2? No, you can't. You got to break it down, x to the 4th times x to the 1. And that's y to the 1, leave it alone. So this is the square root of 4, the square root of 15, the square root of x to the 4th, the square root of x, the square root of y. And let's put what we know the answer to. We know the answer to this one, and that's x squared. We know the answer to this, that's a 2. So 2 times x squared, I like them in the front, no square roots for them. And what's left is this times that. We can use the product rule. That product rule says you can go both ways. This one, it says you can go from here to there or from this to this. You have 3 square roots, you can combine them into 1 and make that the square root of 15xy. 15, the x and the y. One more rule we're going to look at, then we're done with this video, and that is the quotient rule of radicals. Just like the multiplication, the product, we have one for division. And that rule says if you have fraction a over b, you can break it down to 2 separate radicals. You can go from here to there or from this to this. You can go back and forth. So if somebody comes to us and says, what is the square root of 1/4? I go, well, I can break it down to the square root of 1 over the square root of 4. The square root of 1 is 1, the square root of 4 is 2, and that's a half. What is the square root of x squared over 49? I can break it down to the square root of x squared over the square root of 49. The square root of x squared, take the 2 and divide it by 2, that's a 1. Square root of 49 is 7, so my final answer, you're not going to put the 1, it's x over 7. What is the square root of x to the 4th over y to the 6th? That's the square root of x to the 4th over the square root of y to the 6th. Square root of x to the 4th, divide the 4 by 2, that's a 2. Divide the 6 by 2, that's a 3. It's not always going to be beautiful like this. Let's see. What is the square root of 7 over 4? Well, you can break this as the square root of 7 over the square root of 4. The square root of 7, I can't simplify it, has to stay. But the square root of 4, that's a 2. The square root of 3x over 25. I can break it down to the square root of 3x over the square root of 25. The 25 will give me a 5 in the bottom. The top, I can't simplify it. The square root of 2 a to the 6, b to the 10 over the 9. That's the square root of 2 a to the 6, b to the 10 over the square root of 9. Well, in the bottom, we know the square root of 9, that's a 3. But what about the top? I can break it down to the square root of 2 times the square root of a to the 6 times the square root of b to the 10. Now let's look at a to the 6th. That will give me, divide the 6 by 2, that's a to the 3rd. Take the 10 divided by 2, that's b to the 5. And what's left is the square root of 2. One more, square root, I'm making it bigger, 5x to the 7 y squared over the 4. I can break it down, 4 in the bottom with the square root of 5, square root of x to the 7, square root of y squared. The problem with 7 is I can't divide it by 2. So I got to take the 7, break it down. There's the 2 in the bottom. 7 is 6 times 1. X to the 6 times x to the 1. Now, what is the square root of x to the 6? That gives me x to the 3rd. What is the square root of y squared? That gives me a y. What's left is the square root, and I get 5 times x, which is 5x. And that is my final answer for that problem.